Hello, welcome to another edition of Talk It Out. My name is Megs Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director of the Doomer Agriculture Foundation. We are the national voice and champion for mental health in Canadian agriculture, and our topic today is trauma. Joining me today is Kylie Bartel, and I'm going to pass it over to her to do a further introduction of herself.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me, Megs. I love what you guys are doing as the organization. From what I understand, you guys have been around for about 5 years now. You just had your five-year anniversary, so congrats on that. And just the whole idea of being able to talk more is so huge in mental health. So when it comes to my background, I live in Chilliwack, BC. So I work out in BC, and I have my master's degree in counseling psychology. So I'm a registered clinical counselor and a Canadian certified counselor. And I have a private practice where I work with folks both in agriculture and general population. But I have found that I tend to click really well with folks in agriculture because I come from an agricultural background. I don't work in agriculture anymore, but my very first job was one of the summer workers on my uncle's tree farm nursery. So doing lots of weeding, spraying, all of the things that came along with that. He still runs that farm, and that's the family farm that I actually grew up on. And I am really passionate about working with horses, being around horses, and equine assisted mental health, which ends up often being a really great connect, especially for kids that come from agricultural homes and would like to get outside and maybe work on some skills in a more hands-on and interactive way, as opposed to the more traditional counseling setting where we sit inside a room. So that is probably, even though I do traditional counseling, my favorite places are the more nature and equine assisted counseling spaces, where I will work with kids, youth, adults, just wanting to do more to heal from the things that have kind of gotten them stuck, and also just live and thrive a little better. You know, a lot of times suffering can happen on a scale of 1 to 10, and we don't end up going to therapy until it's like 8 or 9 or 10 out of 10 suffering. But if we can come in a little earlier at like 5 or 6 when things are hard, but maybe not completely like holding us down, it actually takes less time, which costs less money, and we can shift things a little bit quicker if we catch it a little earlier, which I find really helpful for the nature and horses stuff because people are a little more interested. There's a little more draw in coming to that than maybe some of the traditional work. So, yeah, probably that's a little bit of a synopsis about me. I also maybe one piece to add on the ag note is that over the last few summers, I have really enjoyed taking my horses, going up to northern Alberta, partnering with some working cowboys and learning more about taking care of cattle and that whole industry as well. So it's being able to contribute and be a part of the BC and the Canadian agriculture community is something that I'm really thankful to be a part of. So
Amazing. I can
yeah,
see how, especially in agriculture, that being out in nature, connecting with nature and horses, that could be a really great fit for a lot of people. It
yeah,
doesn't, we like to talk about how I think a lot of us have this idea of like what therapy is or what it has to be, and that can be
yeah,
a barrier and quite daunting, especially if
yes,
there's a lot of stigma around involving mental health and reaching out, which there is in agriculture. And so having a way to connect where it's a bit of a safer and maybe more comfort zone is really great.
yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
So, on the topic of trauma, and I really liked your comment on suffering and not letting it get to a 10. I think probably
Yeah,
at some point, all of us have get to that point before we've learned
yeah,
that we need to not, or we need to try to not let it get to that point in the future.
for
But
sure.
maybe just talk a little bit about like trauma, what defines trauma. I think
Hmm.
it's something we all define differently, or we can all experience differently. I don't
Hmm.
think anyone gets through life without trauma. Maybe someone has, but I think it's a pretty common
Yeah.
that at some point we'll all experience it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Um, Working with trauma is something that I've had a chance to study a fair bit. It's something I'm actually really passionate about doing. And a lot of times, uh, we talk sometimes when we're talking about trauma, a lot of times we'll differentiate between what we call big T traumas and little t traumas. So the big T traumas would be the things that would probably meet the criteria in the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. A big mouthful, but it's just basically like the big book that we reference to see like what symptoms would qualify for the different diagnoses, so that people can understand what's going on a little more and get pointed in the right direction for the right resources for what they're going through. So PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder, is a very specific diagnosis that has very specific criteria. And if you meet those criteria, there's different categories. That's typically what we call a big T trauma. A lot of times, things in that would be experiences that are life threatening, or maybe you're witnessing something that was life threatening, or something life threatening happened to someone really close to you. Those are typically like the severities and things that we're looking at with big T traumas. The tricky thing, though, is that there's also something that we call little T traumas that might not necessarily meet the criteria, but also can really impact us and have a really challenging effect, like maybe a really difficult breakup or divorce. Maybe not life threatening, but still could be quite emotionally traumatic and get people really stuck. And a lot of times, what the definition that I use, or I learned this in school, for a small T trauma is anything that is negative and unexpected that leaves the person feeling confused, overwhelmed, and powerless. So it's a little bit less about like what happened, and it's a little bit more about how someone experienced what happened, which is, and I like that definition. It kind of works a little bit um, more productively in a therapeutic setting, because what I notice is that sometimes if you take a car accident, for example, two individuals could be in a relatively similar car accident of similar severity, and one person is like, "Whew, that was really tough," but like manages to adapt fairly well and continue on and doesn't get so stuck by it. Whereas another person, similar severity, but could be really traumatized depending on how they've made sense of the experience. And so it's not only about that external criteria, it's also about how we experience it internally and how we've made sense of it. And do we have an understanding? So that idea of confused, overwhelmed, and powerless, those are kind of the key factors of feeling something traumatic. And if we can find corrective emotional experiences in those three categories, it's actually a really important part of healing from trauma. So confusion, the antidote to that is, do I understand what happened? Could I find a way to make sure it wouldn't happen again if I got into a similar situation? Overwhelm, I don't have the resources to deal with this. How do I build more resources, more understanding, maybe rally some more supports? And then powerless, how do I feel powerful? How do I feel like I have more agency, a more sense of strength, or something I could do differently? And it's interesting. It's probably one of the reasons I think why horseback riding can be so therapeutic for people, is that when you have to trust 1,000-pound animal, and then you build a relationship and you successfully ride 1,000-pound animal, or even bigger in some cases, there's a lot of times people who have felt powerless in the past feel a new sense of empowerment in that experience. And so that's one of the many reasons why horses in particular can be quite helpful in healing from trauma. Yeah.
I really enjoy that definition as well, because I think it really puts the ball in each individual's court, because
Mm-hmm.
it can be so hard to say, I need to validate my own feelings for what happened or what I'm experiencing, and to give ourselves kind of grace to do that, instead of just saying, well, someone else has it worse, I need to suck it up and tough it out. And
Mm-hmm.
I think back to, C's just had such a hard go, with the last
Yeah.
couple of years, with fires and flooding and disease and different
Mm-hmm.
things in agriculture. And,
Yeah.
farmers across Canada have had, other challenges as well. And some of those things, I know with the severe flooding in 2019, they decided to then call like every possible rain event atmospheric river, which for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, every time they heard that, was like, it brought up all of those feelings again and again.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's crazy how trauma. So this was one thing that I heard in school that I kind of sunk in with me. I had one professor say that, when it's funny because as you were describing even the floods, and your whole body did a like, oh, like, and
Yeah.
I kind of mirrored it too. You can almost feel it. So it's interesting, when we experience trauma, we often disconnect from our body sensations as a means of self-preservation. It's like, I can't feel this right now because it's too much. I'll feel it later. Right now I just have to deal with whatever is catastrophically happening in front of me, which is why being able to come back into our bodies in a safe way it's a really important part of healing from trauma. And I have noticed, I was fortunate enough to be able to partner with AgSafe BC
I
and
thought you might
work
have, yeah.
pretty closely on the front lines, helping with some of the flood response stuff. And I actually, crazily enough, was on number one highway when I watched it disappear underwater. And thankfully, I was like evacuated to dry ground, and my animals were in a safe place, and I was in a pretty good spot. But I couldn't get home for about a week, and it was definitely too close for comfort. I
Mm.
will say that for sure. But it's just so interesting how with everything that people have been through over these last few years, that disconnect that can happen. So a lot of times, yeah, trauma, it creates this disconnect. We're not connected to our bodies. There's not a lot of integration between our minds, our hearts, emotions, and our body sensations. And so a lot of times the healing work that needs to happen is then how do we find ways to reconnect or reintegrate in a safe way. And there's a fantastic book for any folks who like reading or audiobooks called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And that is probably one of my go-to, that was literally my trauma and sexual abuse counseling textbook in grad school. But the cool thing is it's written for kind of the general population. That's not one of those massive psychology textbooks that feels really dry and
Yeah.
intense. So it's one of the ones, one of my go-to recommendations if anyone's interested in the topic of trauma.
Thank
Mm-hmm.
you for that.
Yeah.
And I liked your comment about how we kind of leave our body and go into that, like what has to happen now. Because I think
Yeah.
in agriculture, especially farmers, we do that all the time, right?
Yep.
You know, we
Mm-hmm.
there's the flood, there's the hail, there's the disease, there's the trade issue, prices tank, and it's like, okay, what do
Yeah.
we need to do right now to get through this time? But
Mm-hmm.
I feel where, you know, what I have seen happen is we don't have ways or know that we need to find a way back to and deal with. So it's like there's always next year.
Yes.
Let's just keep moving forward in the current state.
Yeah.
What
Mm-hmm.
can that do for our overall mental health when we just kind of
Yeah.
stay in that state and move from one thing to the next thing?
Well, this is the thing where we find a lot of folks, if they're staying in that survival mode all the time, that there's higher amounts of stress hormone, cortisol, which is an adrenaline. It's pumping. I got to get this done, and that's a very, very adaptive, healthy, and helpful response to a stress or trauma situation. I'm always like, thank you, body, for digging deep when I'm exhausted and I have to get this done. But if we're staying in those states all the time, it is depleting our energy and our abilities to cope. And what will often happen is if we're staying in those places all the time and we're disconnected, sometimes there's this cognitive impression like I'm fine, like I'm doing the things, so therefore like they're getting done, and that should be the check mark of wellness. But a lot of times, especially for folks in the farming community, things will creep up what we call somatically. So the body, or somatic symptoms, or symptoms that are happening in your body. Things like I'm grinding my teeth while I sleep all night and I'm not waking up feeling rested, or I don't really sleep very well at all in general, or irritable bowel syndrome. My guts are just squirming and not having a good experience with different things, because we know that rest and digest is like a state of our nervous system where we need to repair. When we come out of that intense fight or flight, we're trying to get more into the part of our nervous system that does recovery. And so I think one of the best analogies I like to be able to give folks is like, that when it comes to farming, like our machinery is a really big part of being able to take care of things. Our tractors, they need oil and they need fuel and they need maintenance. And it would be sort of like, you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing all the time. And at some point, if you run the tractor, it's one thing to run out of fuel and you go, oh, shoot, okay, I pushed it a little hard. I can go and bring some more fuel in. But maybe a whole nother thing entirely to seize an engine, run it out of oil. Like there's different levels of, if you keep pushing beyond when you're lights and your meters go off to say, hey, we got to refuel, hey, we need a reset here, the consequences are real. And there's more and more data coming out to suggest that levels of chronic stress or levels of chronically being in go-go mode, it's not always going to cause long-term illness, but there is often a correlation with other health problems and other things that come up when we're in these chronic states of stress. So there's a book called The Hidden Cost of Stress by Dr. Gabor Mate. He's in Vancouver, BC, but he speaks all over the world. So there's different resources there where we're starting to understand this more and more. It's still think we're still only on the edges of really understanding all the science behind it, but there are a lot of pieces out there to start really um, starting to kind of realize that even when if our go-to is always to push through, sometimes our bodies will come in and throw in the trump card and go, you're not resting. Even gosh, like something so simple as over the last 3 weeks, I had a bunch of family events week to week to week. It took about 4 weeks. And then on week 5, what happened? I got a head cold and my whole
Yeah.
body was like, no more. Like we're resting now. You're
Have to
not taking
rest.
enough
Yeah.
break. So yeah, that mind body connection is a really big deal, especially for folks who are in pretty physical jobs and using their bodies all the time. So
Yeah, and what
yeah.
we know from the University of Guelph and the research they've done is
Mm,
that farmers are about 50 to or 68% more susceptible to chronic stress than the general
yeah.
population. And
Yeah.
then in 2021, they also found that 83% of Canadian farmers have lower resiliency scores than the general US population, which I feel
Hmm.
like the general US population is probably not the best like
Sure.
place to begin with, possibly.
Benchmark. Yeah.
Um, but to me,
Hmm.
that speaks to the mental health side of it because we
Yeah.
think and we pride ourselves. I used to be a grain farmer. We pride ourselves on our resiliency because we take
Yes.
these hits, we get up and we just keep going. But
Yeah.
just pushing through and never dealing with the mental health side or finding ways to
Yeah.
top up the oil or, take care of the
Yes.
equipment, do our self-maintenance, that's not
Yes.
actual resiliency. That's just pushing us along to a place where we might break down, as you said, like the physical
Yeah.
comes and says you need to take a break. Um,
Yeah.
this month, one of our interviews was with a farmer, and he talked
Hmm.
about how he realized he had PTSD was he thought he was having a heart attack, and it was his body saying,
Yeah.
you have to, here's some symptoms, something's going on, you need to figure out what's going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. That's so, you know, I hear that and it almost makes me sad because that's not an uncommon story.
Yeah.
Like, I wish it's sad because it's more common than I wish it were. I wish it was far less common that things like that happened, where our bodies had to just kind of throw up the red flag or say, "Hey, we gotta pause here." Um, but it's real and it's true, and I think that this is an interesting thing. So there's lots of different treatments for what we can do when it comes to recovering from trauma, how we treat trauma. It's kind of like there's different therapies out there. One of the gold standards would be EMDR. It's using eye movements to reprocess trauma. Another one is called lifespan integration, building like an integrated self throughout multiple stages of your lifespan. And another one is called internal family systems, where this whole idea that there's like parts to ourselves. And it's interesting because like a lot of times you'll notice kind of three distinct parts. There's like the part that like when they actually call it a firefighter part, like when chaos happens or when trauma happens, this part just like digs in and does whatever it has to do to keep us safe and make the job happen. And that's actually like this is one thing that I love about working with farmers, with folks that actually can push through is I think sometimes they feel like they get their back up against the wall a little bit because people are like, you just slowed down and rested more, you would get better. And they're like, I can't. Like, the sun is out, the harvest needs to come in. This is not like I can't just do a self care break. So, this is where I actually try to ask there's two things. The inner dialogue, how we have the inner dialogue is really important. And then, in the grand scheme of things, it's like, if you can't rest now, how do we expand our capacity in this moment and then plan for rest later? So this idea that you get to pick, but at some point we do have to put fuel back in the tractor,
Mm.
even if you say it can't happen now. I believe you. That's fair. But it's just interesting how that part that can push through, I think it sometimes feels criticized when we're like in mental health and especially in traditional mental health. It's like, can we do some more breathing or meditation? All good things. But sometimes people get a little squirrely and they're like, but I still have so much to do. And so what a lot of times I like to do in an internal family systems approach would be to pause and just thank the part of ourselves that can get her done, that can buckle down and push through and say, like, hey, I see you're working your tail off. I really appreciate how hard you're working to try and get this done. And like, thank you. Full stop. Thank you. Thank you for that part of me that's doing it. And then you can just take a second. And a lot of times when I say those types of things to people, I just watch them take a little breath and their shoulders relax a little. And they're like, okay, you're not going to try to just tell me to ease up or be less intense or whatever. And I'm like, okay, now I'm just saying a thank you to that part that can hustle and get her done and get gritty and dig deep. And also, they might also, maybe they're struggling with relationships in their family. Maybe there are other pressures, other places, or they kind of have that niggling sense that like, yeah, my health isn't as good as it could be. And I don't like that, but I don't know what else to do about that. And then I say, okay, that part that can just dig deep and push through, can we just say, like, I'm super thankful for you. I really appreciate the work you've been doing. Do you think you can just pause and like maybe give us a little space to explore some other options? And we'll come back to you. We're not going to like put you in a corner, put you in a timeout, but we just need to hear some of the other ideas you have going on so that we can get a fuller picture of what's happening here. And without doubt, a lot of the time when I chat with folks, there is another part of them that kind of has a sense or knows like, this isn't actually the most sustainable thing. Like, I can't keep going at this pace forever, but I don't know what else to do. And there is a softer side and a softer part in there, but a lot of times we don't get really clear spaces or places to talk about those things. And I just really enjoy when I get to chat with folks and I get a chance to like really affirm and appreciate those strong parts of them. It's like then all of a sudden those softer or more reflective parts can come forward. And gosh, half the time people actually are have a much greater sense of what they need if they feel like they have permission to
Mhm.
just explore. It's like it changes from the like, I have to, I must, I should, to the like, I could.
Mhm.
Maybe I would like this, or like it just taking that intensity down a notch. It's crazy when we get into that space how many creative ideas farmers and folks actually have for what they need.
Mhm.
But it's almost just like, how do we get out of fifth gear into fourth gear and maybe to third? We're not going all the way to neutral, but like
Yeah.
just gear down a little and just look at this from a few different angles and watch and create some space for what people might need. And they come up with some really cool answers and ideas in that space.
I really
So
like that.
yeah.
And we're always so quick to focus on the negative, right?
Oh,
Especially sometimes if
seriously.
we're noticing something in ourselves or something with someone else where it's like, hey, we see these things, they're not good things, they mean something's wrong, but instead saying like,
Yeah.
I like that, like, thank you for the part of me that was able to get through that. But
Yes.
now what is needed, right? And then
Yes. Yeah.
it's yeah, safer to engage with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just kind of, I think sometimes too, that part that can be so strong and can push through, whether it's in trauma or just challenging situations, as much as that part likes to push through, a lot of times too, it's like it doesn't want to admit that it's tired, because if it
Mhm.
admitted that it was tired, it might never get up and keep going. So it's almost like a survival mechanism. That push, that I'm not going to stop, is part of the survival mechanism. And then it becomes a little bit of a like, if you had permission to pause and then to go and to be thanked and to be sent back out with like fresh, like, I don't know, you almost think of that part being like the worker that's worked all morning, you come in for your lunch break, and then we're
Yeah.
sending you back out. Like, we're not actually quitting the job, but we're taking, what would a nice lunch break look like?
Mhm.
What would nourish, you nourish that part of you to be able to refuel you for what you got coming next. I think that's where, gosh, the topic of resiliency is so interesting, and how we measure it. A lot of different folks have done different research on that topic, and it's something I really enjoy studying. Not only resiliency, but also peak performance. How do we perform under some of the most like adverse circumstances and scenarios? And the crazy thing that we learn in the peak performance world is that our brains do have that negativity bias. How quickly do we want to focus on the negative? Because a lot of times our brains are biased that way because it's the negative that we're trying to solve in order to help us survive. But spending time thinking about the positive doesn't really help us as much. So our brains kind of just push it aside, like, oh, I got that figured out. It's fine. I'm going to focus on this problem. But when we can come at problems from more of a strengths based approach, like, oh, I'm really good at this thing,
Mhm.
and letting us throw some energy and some weight and some RPMs behind that type of stuff, a lot of times that ends up helping us not only perform better, it helps us feel um, more capable of what we're doing. And it also just helps fuel some of that momentum into some of the areas where we might feel weaker. So that's one of the tips, that instead of always trying to pick apart at your weaknesses, lean into your strengths for a little while. Let
Mhm.
those be good. Celebrate yourself for those. And also see if you can find the balance, because it's things like I remember one of my friends or profs who did a lot of studies on grief talked about how when we don't stop and slow down and feel our emotions, at least some of the time, things like ungrieved grief is often the root of so many anxieties and depressions that we don't really understand where they come from.
Mm.
But if we slow down long enough and kind of trace the root back, it was like, there was that thing that happened, and I maybe didn't have a ton of time to process it at that moment. But then when I did have time and there was that almost that fork in the road, I could go back, process this through a little bit, do something, work on it, or continue to soldier on. I went with this, and now these other symptoms are kind of popping up out of the side. I don't really get what these other symptoms are about, but there can be some roots deep
Mhm.
down in there of some other stuff that might just need some processing. Yeah.
I was going to ask about that, how if something does happen and maybe at the time we didn't even realize that it was
Yeah.
traumatic to us, especially if it was a little t, that,
Yeah.
you know, could that be something that maybe we're 5, 10, 15 years down the road, something happens and suddenly it all comes back and we're
Yeah.
caught off guard by it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right that sometimes we can be thrown off right immediately, and then it's like, "Okay, we have to deal with this right now," or if it pops up later, then we're at this kind of fork in the road. Sometimes our bodies will pop up later and be like, maybe we didn't take the time back then, but I'm gonna force you to take the time now," or whatever it might be, but, I always let people know that, you know, as much as especially in therapeutic work, I try really hard to pay attention to detail and to explore things thoroughly and really seek to understand. But I could never fully understand someone else's life or see the world exactly through their eyes the way that they do. So they get to, at the end of the day, be the experts in their own lives. And that includes when they want to do their work. So a lot of times when it comes to traumas, almost think of it like a garden, and all the good plants are the good things in life, and the traumas are the weeds. And sometimes there's one big one, and sometimes the roots are connected to other ones. And this idea that there's different ways we can go about pulling out weeds. And actually, I've heard different people say certain therapies are like EMDR can almost be like taking a rototiller through the whole thing and pulling everything up, and then it's a little bit more unnerving at the beginning, but it's pretty effective in getting stuff moved pretty quickly. Other therapies are a little bit, maybe they don't maybe move as quickly, but they don't disrupt as much. So it's kind of like going in with your trowel and taking out one weed at a time. And I always let people know. So the three stages of trauma processing would be, first one is just stage one is just safety and stabilization, because it's almost like someone was in a massive car accident and you bring them into the hospital and the very surgery they need is actually going to kill them. What do? Well, we put them in a coma. We try to stabilize the situation and get them strong enough to a point where they could survive the surgery. It's a very good physical analogy for what we think of with trauma work. So sometimes when people come in and they're like, yeah, I've had some really tough stuff happen in my childhood. I've had some really tough stuff happen with floods or fires on my farm. And I want to do my processing, but I only have like this much capacity. It would actually be unethical of me as a therapist to go and start like pulling all the deep rooted childhood trauma stuff apart, because it's not actually what's going to serve someone in the short term. So I always work very collaboratively with clients to ask, like, what would you like to tackle? What do you feel like you have the capacity for? And a lot of times we start with smaller things. And
Mhm.
a lot of times when people have a chance to process a few smaller things, it builds up their own trust in themselves and
Mm.
trust in their own ability and capacity to hold it. So it's kind of like almost like emotional weightlifting. We start small and we build our strength from there. So that first stage of just safety stabilization, really working collaboratively with people to figure out what they want to tackle. Then that next stage becomes the reprocessing. There's specific therapies for that. One other one that I didn't mention, sensory motor therapy, is one where you use sensory, like senses and physical movements. Motor is really, it can be really effective for people that want to help move their bodies in the process of processing traumas. So that the actual processing stuff, trying to find new resources that you didn't have at the time, new insights, sometimes creating more supports in that space. So that's the second part. And then the third part of trauma processing would be reintegration into your life outside of the therapy process. So you try to learn some ideas, learn some skills, and then bridge them to outside of therapy. And a lot of times I try to tell my clients, uh, therapy is here as a service to you. You get to decide how much you need to come and what that works like for you, what that looks like for you. And if you ever get to the point where you feel like you don't need me anymore, that is a day we celebrate.
Mm.
I would love to get to a day where I've worked myself out of a job, or you've found the things you needed here and you found ways to bridge them to your life outside of therapy. And then you were like, okay, like I'll maybe shoot you an email in a year if I want to check up, or anything, but if like it's never "Oh, I'm never going to see you again," like we celebrate the idea that someone might not need any more trauma processing, or the other alternative could be, one of my supervisors talked about doing work in chunks. Like come
Mhm.
in, it's almost like doing a course. Like I'm going to do a spring semester of
Yeah.
Kylie 101, and then I'm going to take a summer break and I'm going to go work for a while, and then maybe I'm going to come back and take Kylie 102 next fall, or things like that. You can come in, do a chunk of work, go out, live your life, see how your skills work, take a break, and come in and out. It's not like you have to check into therapy and process every trauma and like try to fix yourself perfectly before you move on to the next chapter. So,
Yeah, that's such an important comment because I think, I mean, there's just so many kind of preconceived notions about therapy. And I think there is that thought process, or can be that thought process of like
mhm.
therapists only want people to keep coming. Um,
Right.
is not
Yeah.
true, right? They want to help you get
Mm-mm.
better, and that's on your
Yeah.
terms, but also that it doesn't just need to be a work until you're done. It can be like, okay, this is what I needed right now. Now I'm gonna go do these
Yes,
things, and if yeah, I can check back, do some stuff later. Um,
exactly.
that's great to put out there. Um,
Yeah.
what would be recommendations for trying to support someone else? And that could be
Mhm.
maybe someone else that has gone through something, but maybe isn't
Mhm.
yet talking to anyone, and also someone else that maybe is working with someone like yourself.
Yep.
How, like, do you just stay out of it unless they bring it up? You know, what is the best way to kind of engage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that certain people receive and desire support in different ways. Sometimes that has to do a little bit with our attachment styles. So there's kind of four key attachment styles, and for some folks under stress, they would be what we'd call more of a withdrawer. They need to kind of be alone. They need to have space to process, and so being able to say things like, "Hey, it seems like you've got a lot going on right now. I'm here if you need me. Let
Mm,
me know." But also like go take a walk, and I've got, maybe if it's your partner or someone in your family, like, I've got dishes tonight, why don't you go take a little bit of a walk tonight, or like take some space. So sometimes people need a bit of space. If there's any like bigger challenges around people being alone, that should be something that should be treated by a mental health professional with a safety plan and things like that. So we're not talking in kind of our extreme
mm,
worries about maybe sending someone who's struggling off by themselves, more so in kind of the manageable day to day, where some people would under stress want to withdraw a little more. For some other folks, they might be a little bit more of that pursuer. They're more of an engager. They might be the type that talks a little more, or they think by talking. And one of the best things you can do with them is go for a walk and just hear them out. And the more you can be out walking in nature, where you get a chance to breathe in fresh air and see beautiful things around you, and even the process of walking, when you have left right, your feet hitting left right on the pavement, it's actually kind of tapping into the neurobiology of why trauma therapies like EMDR work. Because when we have emotional distress, one of the ways we can regulate big emotions is where we get bilateral stimulation of the brain going, which is just a fancy way of getting your brain to fire on your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere, back and forth, back and forth. And that tends to help us like take big emotions and calm them down. And even, gosh, when it comes to research on grounding, I've actually been watching some more videos and things like that about how when we walk barefoot, or when we get our hands in soil and garden and things like that, that is really valuable for taking a lot of the like angsty vibes, and just like, it's in the same way, no electrical circuit works very well without a ground. And
mm,
so when we ground ourselves, gosh, even the other day, a couple weeks ago, I had a chance to go just for a couple hours in the afternoon and spend some time by Harrison Lake, near where I live, and just sit on the beach and then put my feet in the water, and that experience of being close to the ground, touching the ground, getting my feet touching the ground was just, I walked out of there feeling 10 pounds lighter. So this whole idea that when we're supporting people that we love, um, there's different people. So you have to ask the person who's struggling, what is it you need? They get to be the expert on what they need, and try your best to, sometimes people will say like, I want you to leave me alone, but your gut's like, oh,
mm.
twinging that like maybe they need someone to ask, to say like, I want to hear you. I want to believe you. And just, but I'd love to still check in, like, when would be the best time to do that? Would you prefer a text, a call, a note? Like, what are the things or ways that you can support? And then
And it's okay for those
also
to
just,
change.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. And some people want to hug and want to be touched. Some
Yeah.
people don't want to be touched at all,
I have
so
that
it's
conversation with my children all the time because if I get
yes,
upset, their immediate reaction is like to give me a hug. I'm like, I actually don't want to be touched right now. And it's important to
so true.
understand, like, if you need a hug, I will give you a hug, but I don't
Yes.
need it right now. And to start having those
Yeah,
conversations.
totally. So that's super huge. And just being able to ask the question, what
Yeah.
do they need? And believe them when they tell you. Like, even if it's something that is like completely the opposite of what you would need, the best way to
Mm.
have empathy and to really like hear someone is to what we call like bracket your own experiences or your own feelings just for a moment. It's not to dissociate or to discredit them, but bracket them for a second and really try to dial in and attune to what's being told to you in the moment. That's a huge part of being there. And we know that I forget where the study came from, but I know it's a real study where they measured people that were standing by themselves looking at a mountain that they had to climb, and they measured their stress responses, heart rate, things like that about their perceived task ahead of them. And then they took the same, but they were by themselves looking at the mountain. And then they took the same person and had a loved one stand next to them and look at the mountain. And the way they were able to measure it, the mountain shrunk in the person's perception of what it would take to be able to scale that mountain and accomplish that task. So as human beings, we're wired for connection. We have grown and evolved throughout thousands of years in groups and tribes, and we don't have really big teeth or claws like mountain lions or things to survive long in the wilderness by ourselves. So to some extent or another, we do need each other. And one piece that I always like to mention for folks if they are supporting anyone who's struggling with mental health is that it's a very wise practice to be aware of your scope of practice. So if you're a family member, if you're a friend, what are things you can do? Like kind of, within a certain amount of hours, going for coffees, meals, check-ins, conversations, like all of those friend levels, like those are fantastic things to offer. Things like uh, yeah, being the person who has to stop them from hurting themselves or things like that. That's getting into the range of things where we really are wanting to get some professional mental health treatment involved. And I used to actually be a lifeguard right out of high school, and I think they have a really great principle in lifeguarding where if someone is thrashing in the water, the idea is two drowning people is worse than one drowning person. So it's actually not the protocol to jump right in and try to save them if there's a risk that they could grab you and pull you under and now we have two drowning people. So the first stage is you try to throw out like a flotation device that they could grab onto it, and if they can kind of stabilize themselves and calm down enough, then you can come getting close. Hopefully there's a rope on that ring or something that you threw and you can pull them to safety and deal with stuff. But this whole idea, same with if you're first responder on a scene and you see water and down power lines, like you're not going to just jump right in there and now we have two electrocuted people instead of one or something like that. So this whole idea that when you're supporting someone with mental health, it can be a lot. It can be really challenging. So being able to support, but also have some boundaries around, you know, I try to say like between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., like I need to sleep. If I'm going to be a supportive person to someone who's struggling, I need to make sure like I'm not answering things during those times. Like I need to be sleeping during those times. That's a big part of it. Um, and it's tricky. There's no like black or white checklist of like, here's when you call the professional, here's what you can handle at home. But you also, I kind of ask people to trust their own judgment a little, like check in with their gut. Like, do you feel like you can be there for that person? Or are you starting to feel a little overwhelmed, a little drained, a little burnt out in supporting? And in that stage, a lot of times what we'll do, if we can get at it proactively, is we do something called a wraparound process for a person who's struggling. So it's kind of like this idea that a wraparound, kind of like a safety net or a spider web, that if your spider web is your network of connections, if there are multiple points, anchor points for the web, even if the storms and the wind come in, it's fairly stable and it can kind of withstand the turmoil or the chaos that comes in. But if you're only hanging on by two threads
Mm.
and then the wind comes in, it can be really challenging to manage those things. So if someone is a support person and someone else is struggling, I've seen it happen before, and I've actually been in the shoes where it's really tough, where it's like even before I had my mental health training, where I was trying to support someone struggling with mental health. And eventually I got so burnt out in the situation that I had to put in a pretty hard boundary and remove myself pretty far because it was just so much going on. And had we caught it earlier, had we rallied more supports earlier, I might have been able to stay a little more connected in that support network without feeling like all the weight was on me. And so that's where I would say if you really like love this person and you don't want to have to be out of their lives, being proactive about rallying the right supports and building that network can be a really valuable endeavor.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
something that we talk about all the time as well.
yeah,
And it sounds selfish because people are like, well, I can't put myself first. And it's like, well, if you're not taking care of yourself,
yeah.
eventually you can't pour from an empty cup. So at some
Eh,
point,
oh, so
find
true.
that way to take care of you.
Yeah.
With everything, like with being working with XAPC and
Hmm.
being on the ground for support after the flooding, what
Hmm.
can you say on kind of the community support side? You know, in
Hmm.
agriculture, there are events like that, or it is very real for communities to lose a member to death by suicide. So, how do you have any advice on the support when it's more of that community support and how best to kind of go about that or fit into that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I forget who said this quote somewhere, but the idea that one dose of prevention is worth 10 doses of cure is something I have seen play out often, and I'm a big advocate for prevention. So a lot of time, like prevention of mental health issues, and so facilitating community. What I've seen work really well is there are just some people in the community that are especially gifted at networking, and they kind of are the ones that, like, if you need a certain something or if you're selling something, you know the person you want to let know that you're selling your tractor because they'll have the word out. Like, so many people, and it'll probably be gone by the end of the week if you have those people in your corner or you know who those people are. So those people can be huge resources when it comes to even in the aftermath of the flooding that we had in BC. It was just so inspiring to see these different resource hubs pop up, and each hub had kind of a core coordinator or team of two or three kind of at the core, and then multiple people who made it continue to happen and to work. But I noticed one of the common traits of the coordinators is that they had a heart for others or in service, and were quite attuned to knowing what people needed. So this was kind of interesting. Like, I remember one story where someone in the aftermath of a trauma kind of showed up at a hub kind of dazed, and they tried asking, what do you need? And they were so overwhelmed that they couldn't even articulate what they needed. And that's when the hub coordinator saw them, knew a little bit of the backstory, knew enough about the community, and just grabbed a bag and started putting stuff in there. And how many, this was like a story we heard often, is that especially for the farming folks, they would say, don't worry, I don't need the boots. I don't need the jacket. I don't need it. Give it to someone who really needs it. I can get by. I can make do. And that was where having people, it was actually like a lot of these like mama bear figures in
Yeah,
the community, or like papa bear, like they were all in their own different roles, but they would be like, shut up, take
you're
it.
taking
And
this, yeah.
it was honestly beautiful and so good, because I think that maybe for some folks it's pride. I didn't really get the impression that it's pride that stops people from receiving things. It was more of just like an awareness and a community mindset of like, A, I can endure hard things, and B, I want to make sure that everyone's taken care of. And then when we could actually like help people realize that multiple people were being taken care of and you can receive it too, they kind of softened into that, and that helped. So that's specifically with flood disaster stuff. As far as building community in support of just like mental health prevention in general, um, I don't want to get too high on one of my soapboxes, but maybe it's because I've got like a bit of an old school heart. Like, I love in person, face to face conversations and times. I think our phones and our screens are incredible resources. Even like for us to be able to have this conversation today, I'm so thankful that we can connect from provinces apart and have these really important conversations. So by no means am I like anti technology. However, I
It
do
doesn't
think that
replace.
like it doesn't replace. And there's especially, gosh, if we kind of go all the way back to some of the equine therapy stuff we learned there, like the power of presence, the power of like what we even call like a heart frequency, like the rate of your heartbeat, whether you're really nervous or stressed or calm, has an impact on those around you. It's actually one of the reasons why horses, so many people like, it's funny how many clients I have that when we do horse therapy, we don't actually do very much with the horses. We take chairs out and we sit and we watch them and we just be near them and we interact with them a little bit. and how often that actually just helps people feel better. And a lot of it has to do with horses have bigger hearts and lungs, just anatomy speaking wise. So they have a slower resting heart rate. And there's something about it's kind of like the potency of their calm and peace is more, it's like it's more intense than, or it's more concentrated
Wow.
than the anxieties that we as humans might bring
Mhm.
into the space. And if we let them, let their vibes wear off on us, we walk away more peaceful and calm.
I
It's
didn't
like
realize
the
that's what
coolest
it
thing.
was, but when I was still on
Mm,
farm and I got to a place where I
hmm.
was very burnt out, didn't realize it at the time. But that's where I would escape to, is I'd go to the
Yes.
barn where my horses and the miniature horse were. And even
Yeah.
though the miniature was rather annoying, it just being
Yes.
in that space, just I would
Hmm.
just go out there, hide, cry, and just feel better being
Yes.
with them. And then I would go back to the craziness of farming and life.
Yes, and it's so crazy how we think that we're not, because we're not doing anything
Hmm.
that like how, but it's real. The power of presence is real. And that power of like that, just being able to be in a space, to let your emotions flow, to not be alone, but to also be in the presence of beings that maybe aren't going to ask a bunch more questions. They're just gonna feel you, be with you. And then the cool thing about horses too, there's a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. But even if they have a stressful experience, they are so dialed into their bodies, and they're so, their mind body connection is so pure and intact that when they feel those stressors come up, they have physical ways of releasing it pretty quickly. So often if I have clients that come in, they're feeling some anxiety, some tension, some stuff, and then they leave, and the horses will do things, they'll like lick and chew and yawn, kind of let the tension out of their jaw. And so often they'll go out to the field and they'll roll. So it's almost like they're kind of like getting all that out of their system, and it's like an extra amount of grounding. Like it's like pouring all the anxiety that I picked up and pouring it right back into the ground, and I'm not carrying it on to the rest of my day. Horses are incredibly good at that. So it's just cool to kind of know some of these, like why. Like it's
Yeah.
crazy how I resonate so much with your story, because when I was a kid growing up at the horse barn, like and struggling with who knows, like I was, yeah, middle school bullies or things like that, just having a hard time feeling like I fit in, I could connect. And I would just go to the barn, and the barn was like my safe haven. It was just a place to feel a little more calm and connected. That's a great question. This is a good question I like to ask people when they seem like they're doing well and they seem like they're holding it together. I'm like, but are you calm and connected, or calm and disconnected?
Right.
Because calm and connected is great.
Mm.
Great. Awesome. Ride that wave as far as it'll take you. That's awesome. But calm and disconnected is often a flag for a bit of dissociation, that there could be a bit of a trauma response happening, or a burnout response, or a depressive response. So calm on the surface can be look quite similar, can present
Mm.
quite similar, but what's going on below the surface is really important. So yeah, so all of those things to come full circle. The original question, I think, was how we build community
Well,
around
I think
the
that's yeah,
support,
that was
but
where we came
you
to was
know,
that how do you
yeah.
support as a community when something's happened? But I think the key is like the building the community before something happens.
I think so. And I think the key to this was one thing that I think is really valuable that I learned in the floods, and I also think is cool about horse therapy, is that people, even though like trauma and tragedy will bond people quite quickly, and that's a good thing. I think that being able to come together, turning towards each other in our grieving and processing can be really valuable and have really valuable and helpful long-term outcomes. I think that as far as prevention goes, and I think for longevity, I think you need something positive to come around. Like, I
Mm.
think that's why things like the good old fashioned barn raising, or like anytime we have to go get all the square bales off the field into the barn, it's like we all have to come together for this thing that's good and important, and we bond through that space, and it's a really valuable opportunity to connect. And I noticed that, even in flood response, like at first we all bonded about getting through all the craziness. But if we wanted to sustain that community long term, we needed to like kind of find other ways, other more positive projects to pour our energy into, whether that was like home restoration projects, or like food projects, or even just having a potluck barbecue where we all got to come out, have a little silent auction, hang out around the fire, have a cup of coffee. There was just these things where like, can we find something positive to come around? And I found that that's sometimes one of the reasons I also like doing the equine therapy work, is that sometimes people are like, I don't really just want to come to therapy and sit and talk about the problems all the time. But when it's like we can focus on the horses and how do we bond with the horses? How do we promote great connection and build on the wellness pieces? It feels like there's more of a draw there. Like
Mm.
we're coming together. It's like I would rather have something to fight for. Like we can all come together to fight for rather than something to fight against. Because once that thing that we're fighting against kind of subsides and maybe the seasons pass and the flood waters recede, then what?
Mhm.
Now what?
Mm.
And having something positive and a common ground to come around is a really valuable and helpful thing to have.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah,
We have covered so much. I'm so
yeah.
impressed with everything you've said. Is there anything
Oh.
regarding trauma that you feel we've missed so far that you'd like to touch on
Mm.
before we wrap things up?
You know, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
It's funny how even when I was thinking about meeting with you today, I'm like, oh, I hope I don't fire hose too much information because I
It's
can
awesome.
honestly, I do feel pretty passionately about this topic, and I think especially, yeah, just that mind body connection link is something that I see time and time again. The longer I work in the industry, the more I see that talk therapy gets you so far and it can be really helpful. But when people really want to like drive home and go deep on their trauma healing, having some type of like experiential or embodied practice to go along with that is really important. And it's one of the reasons why I really like that Bessel van der Kolk book, The Body Keeps the Score, because he kind of unpacks like how the body holds trauma, how the physical body can hold psychological trauma. But then he has chapters at the end about like EMDR and theater, that like psychodrama where you like act out different things to process trauma, and yoga practices and all these different ways where you get your body moving in your healing process. And the thing I think that's so cool about that is that it can be hard work for folks to do.
Mm.
However, when I'm talking to farmers are like some of the folks that are the like most keen to get after and do hard work. So there's actually a huge resiliency factor in the population of farmers when you can kind of frame it as in like, we're not just going to sit in a circle and cry for an hour.
Yeah.
Like we're going to actually like, this is hard work. And are you up for it? And
Mm.
if you can like, if you're willing to dig in, we can get some pretty cool stuff done, and we can maybe tweak a few things and really start putting some good stuff, putting some good seeds down into your life and into your existence. And they kind of can go like, oh yeah, oh, like it doesn't
Mhm.
have to last forever. There is light around the corner, and my willingness to do hard work will actually serve me very well in these spaces. And the biggest thing that you just have to build a bridge between is that doing hard emotional work is very similar to doing hard physical work. You just have to be, the hard thing is that if you feel like you can't get the physical work done because the emotions are getting in the way, sometimes they think that, well, then we have to just put all
Mhm.
that to the side. It's not important. But when I work with folks on motivation and how do we get ourselves motivated to do things, that's an internal conversation. That's often a conversation between our minds and our hearts, what we're feeling, what we're thinking. And then you have a physical response or a physical outcome that goes one way or another. So when they can start to see that, oh, by turning towards my inner world, what's happening in my mind and my heart, and then working on some strategies in there, I can actually increase my physical productivity and create more flow instead of maybe so much just grind and hustle.
Mhm.
um, we can even be more productive in the long run
Mm.
if we're willing to look at this a little bit more creatively and take a different approach to things. So yeah, I think that's probably the only other thing I'd add. And something about that, one of my favorite TED Talks for that inner self-talk, different ways to tweak your inner self-talk would be the space between self-esteem and self-compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff. She can have a bit of like a soft, but like a very sweet approach to the way she talks about this, the topic of self-compassion. And a lot of times that idea of softening isn't always the most resonate. It doesn't always draw a lot of people off the get-go, but she's had a really powerful experience of her son has autism, and the experience of raising a son with autism has had her walk through some valleys. And she talks about how the way she talks to herself has helped her do some very hard things. And I just remember when I first heard that, even coming out of a farm, um, a farming family, and some of the ways we think about stuff, that was like, we got to just buckle down. And sometimes the external is just an internal expression of how much I'm getting after myself to try to motivate myself, trying to crack the whip internally on trying to push. And some of these TED Talks about like thinking about myself differently, talking to myself differently
Yeah.
could actually have a result that helps me be more productive and easier to work with in the process. Is worth it's like what, a 20-minute TED Talk. Pop it on while you're going for a drive, and it's not gonna hurt anything. So
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Where would you point people to find resources that are kind of trauma?
Mm, yeah, that's a great
I mean, you've
question.
had some great
Um,
suggestions for books and stuff that I'm definitely going to look up. But as you know,
cool.
if they're looking to like reach out to connect to
Hmm.
something or someone, where's kind of that go-to place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, to be honest, your guys' website's fantastic as far as like all the different like mental health links by province. So definitely start with the website, and then like I'm a little more familiar with resources in BC because that's where I live. So AgSafe BC or whatever organizations are in your specific province are great to connect to. A few of the things I just look for, there's a lot of options online as far as you can Google trauma informed care or trauma informed counseling. That's where some of those therapies that I would recommend for trauma processing with EMDR. Another version of that is called OEI, Observed Experiential Integration. It's a little well less known. It's one that I'm trained in and I found quite helpful for both myself and my clients. So the EMDR, OEI stuff, sensory motor, lifespan integration, and internal family systems, those are some pretty gold standards when it comes to processing trauma. So you can check profiles when you're looking at therapists. Does it mention trauma? Does it mention trauma informed? Are they trained in any of those specific therapies? You can Google those therapies and hear different summaries on how they work and what they're about. One of my favorite Instagram accounts to follow is Matthias J. Barker. He's a licensed mental health counselor in the States, and he does a lot of like, um, he talks a fair bit about internal family systems and trauma, and he offers a fair bit of like journals that you can get that help go through some prompts or like online courses or things like that. So he's a nice one to just have like in your Instagram feed that pops up every so often. Another one that I just heard today, a really good little bit from Instagram called Man Talks. And I don't even know if Connor Beaton is a registered therapist or not, but he's just really passionate about men's mental health issues and talks about kind of the disparity where almost, I think, about 85% of therapists and psychologists are female. And a lot of men are some, like when we look at suicide rates and things, men are often quite a bit higher on that spectrum. So, how do we make sure that we're offering services and resources to people in the ways that we need them? And those are some great resources. And then I would also, this is like the power of community too. Uh, this is where we're like reducing stigma around talking about mental health. And if you know someone who's been to counseling or is connected to mental health, and just you can even ask for a friend if you don't really want it to disclose for
Right.
yourself. But I really do recommend like talk to people who seem to have something good going in their world. Like if
Mhm.
there's proof in the pudding in how they're showing up in life and the presence that they bring, maybe they don't go to therapy, but maybe they've got some good resources, or maybe they have been to therapy and they have someone they could recommend. But I definitely encourage people to think about the 5 people you spend the most time with will probably influence you the most and rub off on you the most with your own um, just your own mood and how you see the world. And so pick those 5 people really intentionally and try to spend time intentionally with people who fill your cup.
Mhm.
And that's a big one. I actually just had this chat with someone recently who's connected to the ag industry, just around supporting a family member who's going through end of stage life hospice care. That's a hard road. And she's just like, I'm trying to support, but I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, how much time are you spending supporting your loved one, and how much time are you spending with people who fill your cup? And she's like, well, actually, when I'm not with my loved one, I actually have some friends that are going through stuff too. And it's like, okay, so you're helping in all these places, but there aren't as many people that are there pouring into you. And so being mindful, being alert and aware to the people who have some of those strengths and who have some of those skills, and then reaching out and saying, hey, can you just meet me for a walk and a coffee? That's
Mhm.
one thing that I think I will save that for folks in agriculture. Um, because they have very physical jobs, when you're thinking about rest and recharging, a lot of times I'll ask people, what does work look like for you?
Mhm.
And then what's the opposite as far as rest goes? So for so many people who have day jobs in offices and sit and are very sedentary, they need to be out and walking and moving a lot more in their spare time. For some folks who are moving their bodies a lot, sometimes sitting and not moving around is going to be more restful. But if you can choose, take some lawn chairs and sit by a river.
Mhm.
Anytime you're sitting by moving water, there's like an effect of releasing negative ions and lifting and brightening mood. Or sit somewhere where like you are away from some of those um, stressful stimuli. So there's just ways to resource, yeah,
Get
and
off the
ask
farm.
questions. Absolutely, seriously, it's tricky because sometimes when people are like, can I see you on Zoom or can I come see you in person? And it's more convenient to do Zoom, but it's actually more beneficial to come in person and to get out of your circumstance because for so many people who work on farms, especially if it's their home, it's like they never get away. So yeah, it's a very important thing to do. Mm-hmm.
Well, Kylie, this has been incredible. Thank
Yeah,
you so much for your
no
time,
problem.
your energy, all of your expertise. I'm super excited to get this posted for everybody.
Yeah,
Can people
my
find,
pleasure.
like, are you putting stuff out online anywhere? Like, can people find you?
Oh, that's a good question. I try I try to get more stuff out online. This summer has been busy for me, so I haven't had as many things out there, but I do have a website. My website is kyliebartel.com. Got an Instagram and a Facebook page that I'm hoping to get some more content going in the next little while. And through the AgSafe BC website, it's really cool actually that AgSafe BC has created some opportunities for farmers and folks in the agriculture industry in BC to access mental health counseling for free. It's fully covered through them. And I'm one of the counselors. There's a few counselors on their list, and they have coverage through them. So that's kind of a cool way to stay connected too. And yeah, and we're hoping to do, my hope is to even get into doing some more self-care and self-growth wellness retreats with the horses where people don't have to have their own horses, but they can come to the barn, they can hear some lectures, they can get away from their own spaces, they can connect with some community, and then do a little bit of work with my horses or the horses at the farm where I work, and just get a chance to have their cup refilled,
Mhm.
learn some skills, and walk away feeling a little more poured into. So we're hoping to build up some more of those in the fall and in the spring. So
Awesome. That's exciting.
yeah, yeah.
For everyone that has been watching, thank you so much for your time. If you're looking to learn more about mental health in agriculture or just mental health in general, or to connect to resources, please head over to domore.ag. If you're looking to connect with our national peer-to-peer support platform, which is fully anonymous, available in English and French for anyone 16 years and older, free and monitored 24/7 by mental health clinicians,